Welcome to the China in the World podcast, a series of discussions examining China's foreign policy and shifting engagement with the world. The China in the World podcast is brought to you by Carnegie China and hosted by me, Paul Hanley. Welcome to the first ever Carnegie China Twitter Spaces event. I'm your host, Paul Hanley. I'm the Maurice R. Greenberg Director's Chair of Carnegie China. And delighted to be joined by friends and colleagues, Sasha Gabuev from the Carnegie Endowment and Amy Chu. And this is part of our ongoing Distinguished Speaker Series. We're bringing in experts from around the world to look at ongoing developments related to China's foreign policy. And today we're going to talk about latest developments in China-Russia relations and the war in Ukraine. As I said, this is our first attempt at Twitter Spaces, so I'm just going to say right up front, I appreciate in advance all of your patience with us. The event is being live streamed and recorded, and we're going to publish it later as an episode on our China in the World podcast. We're going to have a Q&A session at the end as well that opens up to listeners after I do a bit of a moderated discussion with Sasha and Amy before the Q&A. If you have any questions related to what we are discussing, press the comment icon on the bottom right of your screen if you're tuning in through your phone, or tweet at Carnegie China with hashtag #AskCC to post your question if you're joining us today from a web browser. So with that, let me turn to today's discussions, and I'll start by just introducing who our experts are tonight. As I mentioned, from the Carnegie Endowment, we have Sasha Gabuev, Alexander Gabuev. I'm going to call him Sasha because he's my friend, and that's what I call him. He's the director of Carnegie Russia Eurasia Center. Sasha, where are you calling in from tonight? Not sure. I think you have to click the microphone on button. I can't hear you. Well, I'll go ahead and continue to introduce you, and then maybe we'll get you on the line at some point. Sasha's research at Carnegie is focused on Russian foreign policy, with particular focus on the impact of the war in Ukraine and the Sino-Russia relationship. Sasha joined Carnegie in 2015, and he's had since that time has contributed commentary and analysis to a wide range of publications, including the Financial Times, the Wall Street Journal, and The Economist. Interestingly, he began his career as a journalist and was a member of the editorial board of Kommersant. He was deputy editor-in-chief of Kommersant Last, which is at the time was one of Russia's most influential news weeklies. And he started his career at Kommersant in 2007 as a senior diplomatic reporter and as a member of the Kremlin press corps and as deputy foreign editor for Kommersant. So let me just say, Alexander, Sasha, welcome. Where are you calling in from?
Thanks, Paul. I'm calling from Lisbon. I'm here for an Asia strategy group bringing together various China heads. We are missing you, but I will be the proud representative of the Carnegie family.
I wouldn't mind a trip to Lisbon. So next time, keep me in mind. That sounds fun. Well, thanks for joining, even while you're at the conference.
Happy to be with you.
Terrific. Next, I want to introduce Amy. Amy Chu is an independent journalist, and I'll ask her where she's calling in from in a second. But Amy covers Asia, including the impact of the Russia-Ukraine war on the region, security affairs, climate change, and politics. She interviewed, in fact, the Ukrainian President Zelenskyy last year in an exclusive interview where he first expressed his interest in talking to the Chinese leadership, President Xi, and to explore a role for China in ending the war and restoring Ukraine's sovereignty. And I'm going to ask her about that in a second because that sounds extremely interesting. She's currently writing for regional publications like Nikkei Asia, Al Jazeera, and the Lowy Institute. She's a regular speaker and moderator in webinars. and she was previously a senior correspondent for Channel News Asia, Star Malaysia, and Reuters Jakarta. Amy has covered regime change in Malaysia, Indonesia, as well as the Arab Spring in Libya and Egypt, which gives her unique insights into factors that reshape societies. Amy, welcome to our Twitter Spaces event. Where are you calling in from tonight?
Hi, good evening. Yeah, I'm calling in from Kuala Lumpur.
Fantastic. And tell me a little bit, if you could, about just to sort of start out, about your interview with President Zelenskyy. Where did you do that? How did that happen? And how did that interview go?
Well, I actually interviewed him while I was in Kuala Lumpur. It was via Zoom, and it was a very interesting and, of course, a very exciting opportunity for me. And I found him to be very intelligent, very sharp. He gave me 45 minutes of his time. I was very grateful. And also after the interview, despite traveling around, he actually made a few short minutes just to thank me and to wish me good luck and good health. And and I thought that was really, really very nice and warm of him.
That's amazing. 45 minutes of his time. That's quite a bit. And it sounds like he's quite a personal leader as well. Well, fascinating. We'll look forward to hearing some of your insights tonight as well as Sasha's. And with that, why don't I just kick it off with the first question and just sort of set a baseline here, current status of the war in Ukraine, and look at that as a window into how it's impacting the China-Russia relationship. We have seen in recent weeks, Ukraine, of course, announced the launch of its counteroffensive into 5 areas in Donetsk. I don't yet see, I could be wrong, you can tell me if I'm wrong, I haven't seen significant gains so far in that counteroffensive. The war in Ukraine, as everyone knows, has been going on now for more than 15 months. Hundreds of thousands of troops have died in both the Russian and the Ukrainian side. Let me just start out, and I'll start with Sasha and just ask kind of your general assessment of the current situation. And based on the current trajectory, how long do you think the war can and will continue? Sasha, why don't you kick it off?
Paul, I think that we are in a very early stage of the Ukrainian counteroffensive. It's in its infancy, so it's really too early to tell of the trajectory of the counteroffensive itself. I think that it will go throughout summer and probably September and October based on what happened last year when the Ukrainians liberated large parts of the south of the country and that made very significant gains in the east, in northeast, in the Kharkiv region. But by the time the Russians were not dug in, now we know that the Russians spent this winter and part of spring in fortifying their positions and really digging in. So Ukrainians will need a lot of luck, a lot of skill, and a lot of sacrifices to conquer large swaths of their territories back. It's all contingent, so it's war, it's unpredictable, and you as a former military officer know it much better than I do, since I'm purely a civilian person. But everything I read tells me that there will be no miracles. Everybody wishes Ukraine a lot of luck and success, but it's unlikely to expect that this counteroffensive itself will bring the end to the war and victory in definition of President Zelenskyy, which means full restoration of Ukrainian territory in 1991, internationally recognized borders, including Crimea, Russia accepting its defeat, paying reparations, and sending war criminals to an international tribunal, either to Kiev or to The Hague, including senior Russian leadership with probably Mr. Putin himself. That is unlikely to happen this year, if at all.
Yeah. No, that all makes sense. And thank you for setting that important context. Early stages, this will go on for several months through the summer into the fall. And as you suggest, it will involve, need some luck, skill and sacrifices. I think that's very, very well put. And as you suggest, President Zelenskyy and the Ukrainians have set some goals, and those are, pretty difficult to achieve, especially in that short time frame. Let me turn to, thank you for that, Sasha. Let me turn to Amy, get your perspectives on, in general, where we are in the current status. Anything that Sasha said that you have a different perspective, and how long do you expect this, war to go on, and based on its current trajectory?
Well, I think Sasha will have a better grip and analysis of that. But I think if it's very, very optimistic, it would be at the end of this year. But, that's not really very realistic. Realistically, maybe another year. I think everyone is watching what's happening in the U.S. elections next year, especially Ukrainians, because they don't know whether Joe Biden will be reelected and a Republican president may not be so friendly to Ukraine, and the most pessimistic outlook would be that it goes on for a very long time. Yeah, I think that's probably more realistic. Sasha, as you know, Western countries have continued to supply Ukraine with sophisticated offensive weapons. President Putin may have envisioned that the Western alliance would be slow or ineffective before he launched his invasion into Ukraine. But NATO so far has appeared relatively resolved and united. And given that neither side is backing down, in your mind, is there a risk here of escalation? There's been concerns expressed about the war evolving or escalating to the nuclear level. Let me just ask, early on in this conversation, what lengths you believe Putin would go to make sure he doesn't lose this war? Sasha, can you hear me? Amy, can you hear me? Yes, I can hear you. We all know that Russia has threatened quite often enough that it will use nuclear weapons. But I think that for the Ukrainians, they are prepared for that, and I also think that they've shown a lot of resolve. And I was just speaking to one of them this afternoon, and for them, nuclear war, no nuclear war, for them, the worst for them has actually happened, with the blasting of the dam, because it's an environmental disaster. And for them, it's almost equivalent to the Chernobyl disaster. Thousands of people have been evacuated. Many more died. We don't know how many. The southern part of Ukraine is going to be very dry now. They're going to be without fresh water for a very long time. Their lands are destroyed. And in many ways, that was the agricultural heartland of Ukraine. So whether nuclear war or not nuclear war, the Ukrainians are just going to dig in and continue fighting, because for them, what happened last week was already the absolute worst. Yeah, it's a horrific situation, and as you say, an environmental disaster. And it's hard to imagine it getting worse. Sasha, I see you've rejoined. Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can.
Great. Before Amy raised the issue of the blasting of the dam, we were also talking about, and I don't know if you heard my question to you about, how high in your mind is the risk of escalation, and could it evolve or escalate to the nuclear level? And in other words, what lengths do you think Putin will go to make sure that the Russians don't lose this war?
I think that the risk is not zero. For now, it's low, although we hear some senior Russian officials, including former President Medvedev, who is now Putin's deputy on the Security Council raising this prospect and some Russian experts discussing that. But I think that Putin is prepared for a very long confrontation. That was very clear yesterday when he was speaking to the so-called war correspondents, which are basically Russian military propagandists working for state media, and for some of them represent Telegram channel tied to various fighting units. So he looked relaxed, and he looked like someone who is projecting a timeline similar to World War II or Iraq-Iran war, a war that lasts a couple of years, that sees setbacks, but ultimately the Russians will prevail. And I think that the way to think about that is that we have seen his maximalist ambitions, Plan A. That's how the war started, where the Russians wanted to take Kiev, wanted to overthrow Zelenskyy government and create a friendly state run by a pro-Russian politician. And they obviously failed miserably due to the courage of Ukrainian nationwide resistance effort and tremendous amount of Western support. But absent Plan A, probably Putin can settle for Plan B, which is a lasting war that bleeds Ukraine, that destroys its economy, and the blowing up of the dam is one of the episodes and the demonstration of the toolkit that the Russians can deploy, make it depopulated, broken, and not inside NATO and the EU. That's Plan B that the Russia is trying to achieve now, and then a lot is really in the hands of Ukrainians and the West. The question is, how long is the West ready to provide all of the support that's needed to sustain the Ukrainian defense effort?
And on that last question, Sasha, what is your sense of, the Russian leadership? Do you think they believe the Western alliance will hold in terms of maintaining unified support for Ukraine, or do they see that with this presidential election coming, there's a chance that it may weaken?
I think that the expectation is that the support will weaken. It's not necessarily tied to the election cycle in the US only. I think that here it's very important to understand that the challenge is that Mr. Putin is ready to fight for a number of years. It's not that if it's Joe Biden again and then another big package of military assistance to Ukraine is signed off, Vladimir Putin will say, oh, I'm sorry, I was wrong in my calculation. The Western Reserve is there. I'm packing and I'm leaving internationally recognized territory of Ukraine. And by the way, I've purchased myself a ticket to The Hague and I'm bringing all of the war criminals with me. That's unlikely to happen. I think that Russia is there in the long haul. And the hope is that probably Russia has seen effort in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in Libya, in Syria, and then with every episode, the attention span gets shorter and shorter and shorter. So the expectation is that after a couple of years, the West will pack and leave, or the assistance will be small enough for the Russian to sustain the war effort. And then maybe there will be a new election in France, and we'll have a kind of Russia-friendly leader. Maybe some of the countries inside the European Union will stop supporting and paying and providing weapons and money. So something will happen over this 3-5 years period that will allow Russia to proceed with this Plan B, which is basically a dysfunctional, destructive Ukraine.
Amy, let me ask you that question from your vantage point in Southeast Asia, in terms of this, Western alliance. What are some of the views in Southeast Asia, maybe even China? What's your sense of what Chinese officials might believe around whether or not the Western alliance will hold in maintaining a unified support for Ukraine?
Okay, for this point, first of all, I would like to talk a little bit about His Excellency's Li Hui's visit to China, to Ukraine last month, because I think what happened there is very revealing of how China thinks about Ukraine, and how China thinks about Russia, and how China views this war. First of all, let's talk about the optics, because sometimes a picture paints 1,000 words. So His Excellency Li Hui did not visit Bucha, where more than 1,000 civilians were massacred. He also did not partake in the wreath-laying ceremony at the Wall of Remembrance of the Fallen, which is actually part of the program for all international delegations visiting Ukraine. And yes, I know Li reiterated that China is willing to serve as a peace broker for resolving the Ukrainian crisis. But for those people who were actually at the meeting, some of them feel that the visit by Li Hui was not so much to assess the situation on the ground, the death and destruction wreaked by Russia's invasion, but more a visit to gauge how determined Ukraine is in going ahead with counteroffensive, a counteroffensive which in China view is more of an escalation. China sees this war in Ukraine through the prism of its rivalry with the collective West, and sending a special representative to Kiev and other capitals was what we would say a reconnaissance mission to see how strong the Euro-Atlantic unity is. The unity of the West, not just when it comes to Ukraine, is a main challenge for China. And breaking this unity is a main strategic objective for China. It's a critical factor to secure further growth of its influence by playing on differences between NATO and its allies. And the second point I just would like to make that China is worried about Putin. They don't want him to fall. Even limited success of the counteroffensive can trigger destabilization in Russia. There will be fighting between the military, Chechens, Wagner Group, FSB, complete chaos. And once the boss is weak, all these different groups will go after him. And China believes only Putin can keep things under control. China sees Putin as the only person who can contain and balance the rivalry between FSB, Chechens, Defense Ministry, Wagner groups, and etc. And for now, Putin is in control. And I believe, China wants him to stay that way. He's internationally isolated and therefore more comfortable partner for China in its strategic quest against the collective West.
Thank you for that, Amy. Why don't I, those are excellent contributions, and I'll continue on maybe a little bit on this issue of Li Hui, the Chinese envoy who was in Europe recently and Ukraine. Went to Poland, France, Germany, headquarters of the EU, and Russia, and then Ukraine to discuss, a quote unquote political settlement of the crisis. It was originally reported that Li Hui had called while he was traveling on these visits for an immediate ceasefire, which, of course, in the West and according to Ukraine, would really potentially signal an endorsement of Russia's seizure of the territory they've taken so far. The Ukrainian foreign minister, however, claims that Li Hui did not propose a ceasefire at the current boundary line. So, Sasha, I'm just interested to know from you, how did you see his visit? Was it at all successful in trying to achieve what the Chinese side was trying to accomplish? And did he call for a ceasefire? What was the approach that he took?
I think that zooming out and looking at the Chinese optics, I very much side with Amy. I also think that China is now very realistic that both sides are miles apart in what they can agree on when we are talking about final resolution of this conflict. The Ukrainian ask is 1991 borders, reparations, and accountability for war criminals, where Russia wants to settle for nothing less than either Ukraine under Russian control or Ukraine destroyed. It's very difficult to bridge that gap, and China knows that well. So China needs imitation of a diplomatic process in order to stay clear and present itself to the audience in the West, particularly in Europe and in the developing world, that it's not backing Russia, that maintaining productive ties, increasing trade, even being part of the Russian military-industrial complex supply chain is something normal, and that's also balanced by China's outreach to Ukraine and to its friends in the West. And that China is the only permanent member of the UN Security Council that's trying to really bring about peace at the time when Russia is fighting this war and the US, United Kingdom, and France are providing weapons to the other party of war. So here, I think that in terms of projecting this image to the audience in the global South and in Europe, Li Hui's mission has some mixed results, but it is somewhat successful. I don't think that anybody in Europe is 100% convinced, but here the line that, we are just before this counteroffensive, the two sides are miles apart from each other. We're just trying to collect pieces of information, identifying the red lines, and figure out how we can bridge this gap based on the 12-point position paper that China presented in late February. I think this has been accomplished. I've heard from a couple of interlocutors that Li Hui indeed flagged this idea that, why don't we offer a ceasefire right now and then start talking? What kind of negotiations can really go on when the guns are not silent? But definitely that was pushed back against in Kiev and in Western capitals as well. Probably, and that's my final point, China might come back to the negotiation table and to this shuttle diplomacy when the counteroffensive is over. If there is a window for diplomatic opportunity for ceasefire later in this year, China might want to be at the table and China might want to be actively playing a role there.
Amy said that in her view, China is worried about Putin right now. I wanted to get a sense from you whether you agree with that, but also how strong, after 15 months of the war in Ukraine, how strong do you assess the China-Russia relationship? Do you think that it's stronger or weaker since the start of the war?
I think that China is indeed, if not worried, but China's objective is to keep Vladimir Putin in power or somebody similar to him. Like the system needs to be intact in order for Russia to be a comfortable, predictable partner for China. And China needs friends. If the view in Beijing is that it's in an era of prolonged confrontation with the United States, there is nothing that China can do about that, absent basically capitulation, that China throws away its ambitions in technology. I don't know, Xi Jinping steps down and China introduces partial democratization, particularly in Hong Kong. Absent that, the view in China is that, okay, the Americans really want to bring down our rights, and that's something that we cannot afford. So the U.S. relies on a group of allies and friends, where China's friends are not really there, and we need partners. So Russia is a very strong partner that can bring a lot to the table. It's a like-minded permanent member of the UN Security Council. It's still a formidable military power, particularly if one considers the Russian nuclear arsenal. It can bring some limited technological assets to the table when it comes to the military, like surface-to-air missiles or nuclear-powered submarines. And it also has a huge endowment for natural resources. China is interested in keeping Russia as it is, sanctioned, hostile to the West, and deeply in China's embrace. And I think that as long as that's there, China is agnostic where the front line really is. As for the relationship itself, I think it has fortified. We see growth in trade. We see that China is not fully siding with Russia, which is very predictable. China has reacted the same way to the war in Georgia in 2008 or to Russia's unlawful annexation of Crimea in 2014. But at the same time, China is doing a lot to provide Russia with a cash flow to sustain the system. And then very finally, if you look at the people who Xi Jinping put as interlocutors with Russia in his third term, that's really a stellar team of the people closest to him. We see Cai Qi, number 5 on the Politburo, being point person for the political dialogue. His interlocutor is Putin's chief of staff, Anton Vaino. And then on the economy, there are 2 most senior vice premiers, Ding Xuexiang, who is a standing committee of the Politburo member, and He Lifeng, who is also kind of very influential. And then there are multiple layers of people in the Chinese system talking to their Russian counterparts. So I think that this relationship is indeed stronger than it was 15 months ago.
And you've talked in the past about the personal relationship between the 2 leaders. How important of a factor is that?
We think increasingly leader-centric political regimes in both Moscow and Beijing. Xi Jinping has started his third unprecedented term. The paradigm for power succession in China has shifted. Even if he steps down in 5 years from his position as PRC chairman or the secretary general of the party, which is unlikely, but we don't have a crystal ball to know, he will definitely be the most influential leader in China. And Vladimir Putin has no other way as to stay in power indefinitely. He has no clear successor, and we don't see any preparation for a succession plan. So his election is in March next year. And at this point, there are no doubts that he will easily win heavily managed re-election. As these 2 leaders stay in power, their relationship, their personal relationship and professional friendship, the way that they are deeply anti-Western and very skeptical of the U.S. intentions to bring down their regimes is there, and that will be a glue that sticks the 2 countries together. But also beyond this personal rapport, there is huge amount of pragmatic interest of these 2 authoritarian powers to maintain very pragmatic, deepening ties.
Thank you. Amy, let's shift to Asia a little bit. In the aftermath of the invasion last year, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, countries in Asia positioned themselves in various ways. When the war broke out, several countries in Southeast Asia condemned Russia's invasion, but only Singapore, where I'm calling in from tonight, it was only Singapore that joined in the multilateral sanctions. U.S. allies, of course, Korea, Japan, on the other hand, they strongly opposed Russia's invasion. How are, in your view, how would you describe positioning of the other countries in Asia with respect to the Ukraine war, either by siding with Ukraine, Russia, or trying to remain neutral? And have there been changes in these positions since the war broke out, perhaps given the ongoing economic hardships that have been caused by the war?
Okay, I think it's a mixed bag in Southeast Asia. And also, I think that you also need to look at the stance that the Southeast Asian governments have taken and contrast that with the stance of the people. So, like in Southeast Asia, Singapore, as you said, is the only country that has imposed sanctions. And I think that in the UN vote condemning Russia's invasion of Ukraine, you see countries like Malaysia and Indonesia, they also voted to condemn it. But if you were to look at their society, take Malaysia, for example, I think that there was a Pew research last year, and in it, it reported that 47% of Malaysians still look upon Russia favorably. And this is very surprising when you think about the fact that Malaysia was amongst the first foreigners to suffer the effect of Russia's aggression in the form of the shooting down of our plane, MH17. And yet you see that 47% of Malaysians still view Russia favorably. And I can attribute this to maybe, like 2 or 3 factors. One, Russia propaganda is pretty strong here. And you'll be amazed, I have people tweeting to me saying that, oh, Ukraine was responsible for shooting down MH17, and we all know that that's not true. Secondly, it also viewed from the prism of the fact that in Muslim majorities countries like Malaysia and Indonesia, the majority are still very hurt by U.S. invasion of Iraq. And then also there is the issue of Palestine, which is very close to their hearts. And one of the reasons in which why you do see this pro-Russian sentiment in countries like Malaysia and Indonesia, it's because they see Russia as someone who's standing up against US, against the West, and hence this pro-Russia stance. And from afar, maybe it seems that, oh, maybe it doesn't matter very much, but personally, not personally, professionally, I believe it is very important because, like governments are sensitive to how the people feel, and this will affect how they will vote in the United Nations. For one. Secondly, we all know that Russia is heavily sanctioned, and this impedes the ability to source for chips to manufacture their weapons, which they desperately need to replenish their weapons. And it is believed that they are coming to countries like Southeast Asia to source for those chips to replenish their weapons. And I believe that this kind of attitude would also somehow would have an impact on how companies behave towards Russia coming to source for goods. I'm not in any way saying that any companies in Malaysia or Indonesia is supplying chips to Russia, but these are some of the factors that one needs to think about.
Fascinating. Thank you for that. Sasha, we can shift to Central Asia, where President Xi recently held summit with the 6 leaders from Central Asia in mid-May. And, the commentators have suggested that, China and Russia could potentially butt heads in the region as China expands its economic engagement. Moscow obviously has been a traditional sphere of influence. In your view, are Russian and Chinese interests in the region generally more complementary, or are they diverging? And in particular, as the war in Ukraine goes on?
I think that the interests have been complementary for many years and are largely complementary at this stage. Russia and China want the authoritarian regimes in those countries to stay in power. They are interested in security of the region, and they believe that security is best addressed by hands-on governance models that we see in all of the countries, with probably the exception of Kyrgyzstan, which is somewhat more volatile. But other than that, Russia is interested in securing its southern flank, where China is mostly interested in getting the resources. Yes, over time, Chinese soft power in the region is growing. Its hard security interests are more pronounced. But I think that here, Russia and China, since they are locked in this asymmetrical partnership, all the time find ways to cooperate. And I don't think that this region will be a source of major tensions. My Carnegie colleague Timur Umarov and I are having a forthcoming piece where we break down the logic for this.
I saw Timur on our Twitter Spaces here a little while ago, but I think he may have hopped off. I was going to ask him at some point as well. Maybe he'll rejoin. One of the big questions, Sasha, that has been out there is whether or not Russia will provide lethal assistance. I'm sorry, whether China would provide lethal assistance to Russia in the context of the war that it's carrying out in Ukraine. There's been reports that have shown, Chinese-built armored trucks in Chechnya, Russia and China also held their, annual joint bomber drills over the Sea of Japan last week. Wall Street Journal yesterday reported that Chinese parts were found in Iranian supplied drones to Russia, but there's not a lot of evidence that Beijing is providing systemic military support or lethal aid to Russia yet. How do you see this playing out, and how strong are the China-Russia military relations and ties? Are there limits to the cooperation that China will provide in the current stage of the war?
A couple of very quick points. First, I don't think that China will provide any significant military assistance to the Russian war effort. China is doing a lot. China is of Russian exports, providing money, and like all of the increased cash flows that Russia has is coming from China. Russia is having access to the Chinese financial system, so it's using RMB in trade settlement, not only with China, but with other parties. That's important. Russia has access to Chinese chips and multiple dual-use goods. And then all of the supply chain networks that were described by Wall Street Journal, courtesy to the US government earlier this year, go back years, if not decades. And these are links between sanctioned Russian entities and sanctioned Chinese entities. If you cut off a couple of heads of this snake or dragon, new heads will grow. So not that much that can be done about it. And this also remains limited. Why? Because, again, China is agnostic about where the front line is. As long as Russia is not defeated in a sense that it brings down Putin's regime, Russian success on the battlefield doesn't matter much to China. Whether Russia controls Bakhmut or it loses Bakhmut or other cities is absolutely not of China's business. At the time where China wants to portray itself as neutral and as a peacemaker, it's definitely not interested in giving Russia anything substantial, because I think that the assumption is there that the US intelligence community will be able to find it out, to document it, and to bring it to the attention of the global audience. So here, China is very cautious. What's more important, in my view, is the development of military-to-military ties. And it's the other way around. Before the war, we saw that Russia was interested in cooperating with China and sharing some weapons designs or selling some advanced systems. After annexation of Crimea, Russia finally agreed to sell S-400 surface-to-air missiles and Su-35 fighter jets that are important for potential contingency in Taiwan or the South China Sea, but not the cutting-edge technology that Russia had. I think that now we probably have evidence that this is happening or this is under discussion. I'll give you one example. When Xi Jinping visited Moscow in March this year, in the first day of talks with Putin, he was wondering why. But the second day started with the closed-door negotiations, where 2/3 of the Russian team were people directly involved in military-industrial complex and Russian arm exports. The substance of these talks have never been published. No documents have been signed. But most likely, the substance of discussion was really sharing of Russian weapons designs with the PLA. I think that's really of huge significance.
The other way around, as you say. We've got about 15 minutes left, and I want to, open it up for those who might have questions. And I think on your Twitter app, you click the request button, which I think is shaped like a microphone. Should be in the bottom left corner of your screen if you want to ask any questions. And I'll see if I can figure out how to manage this, given it's my first time doing this Twitter Spaces. When you receive notification you've been approved to be a speaker, you can go ahead and begin talking. And while we're waiting for people to ask questions, I'll move on and ask one of Amy. Oh, I see one coming in. Let me see. sure how that's done. So let me ask Amy a question around the economic sanctions. The data suggests that Russia's economy has not been hurt as much as expected from international sanctions. Russia's economy only shrank by 2% in 2022, largely due to continued oil exports. What do you think? How is that perceived in the region? And in China in particular, what do you think China is learning, if anything, from Russia's experience of multilateral sanctions?
Oh, hi, I'm really sorry. I didn't catch you. I didn't catch the question because the signal was down. Could you please repeat it?
Sure. I was asking about the international sanctions on Russia. It does not appear as Russia has been hurt as much as expected, in that the Russian economy only shrank 2% last year, according to some official data. What do you think China is learning from, if anything, from Russia's experience of the multilateral sanctions?
China is an export-oriented economy, and obviously, I believe that it will look at it and it would breaking the sanctions, and therefore I totally agree what Sasha said. There will be nothing substantial from China to Russia in terms of supply of weapons. So I do think it is something that China will take seriously. But having said that, what this war has served to do is to diminish Russia's influence. And right now, if you were to ask me about China-Russia ties, China right now is the big brother and Russia has become the little brother.
Interesting. Sasha, anything you want to add to that?
I agree to that, but I think that what we see, for example, in relationship between China and North Korea is that China is the big brother, the Guga. The thing is that it doesn't have 100% control over North Korean foreign policy choices. For example, the North Korean regime most likely was engaged in killing Kim Jong-un's half brother, who was under some sort of Chinese protection. And then China couldn't do anything about that. I think that Russia is a far bigger and more powerful animal than North Korea. So there will be this seniority and there will be leverage that China has. The asymmetry is deeply inbuilt in the relationship, but it doesn't give China 100% control over Russia's foreign policy choices or domestic policy choices. Where China is aided at is that Russia is now deeply anti-American. It believes that war is organizing principle of Russia's foreign policy, and then finding a way to pay back to the US for its support of Ukraine is something that Russia needs to do. And then if it can give China some resources, be it military technology or access to oil and gas and other resources, in order to compete with the US, that's something good for Russia. Because enemy of my enemy is my friend. That's the rallying cry in the Kremlin.
Terrific. Let me ask a couple more questions and see if I can figure out how to respond to those that want to ask questions. I do want to make sure I ask a question on Taiwan. A lot of interest with regard to the question of whether or not, Russia's experience on the battlefield in Ukraine would in some way affect the Chinese calculus in terms of the risk of trying to invade Taiwan. And do you think, and let me start with Sasha, and I'll turn to Amy to respond as well. I mean, is it your sense that the conclusion from the Chinese side is that it probably needs to take into account the lessons learned from what they're seeing in Russia? Is the risks of an attack on Taiwan, would you say they're higher or lower than before the war in Ukraine? if anything, we see an island invasion more difficult to pull off than Putin's land invasion. On the other hand, China may suffer from, President Xi, in fact, may suffer from the same ailments that plagued Putin, insofar as his generals may give him news that he wants to hear about China's military modernization and its ability to seize Taiwan. What's your sense on this question, Sasha?
I think that it's too early to arrive at conclusions about lessons learned because, unfortunately, the war is ongoing. So we won't know what the lessons are before this terrible tragedy is over. And I think that we could drive very different conclusions a year ago or 10 months ago, depending on where we are in this war. And if the agreement is that this war will be lasting, I think that there is various ways on what China can learn from it. That's point number one. And I think that China is a system that loves learning from the collapse of the Soviet Union, which was more than 3 decades ago. Second point here is that probably one of the major lessons is exactly the one you mentioned, that you need to be very cautious about what your generals tell you, and you need to be sure that your economy is more sanctions proof that Russia believes its economy is. Before the invasion, Putin said that Russian economy is 90% sanctions proof, and yet the heat was very strong. Had not Russia had the very competent team at the central bank and Minister of Foreign Affairs, have not the prices for oil and gas being so high, and Europe having need to import oil and gas from Russia throughout last year, the Russian economy might be in a very different place. So I think that China would be smart and wise to look into this and understand that if you want to launch an offensive, you really need to prepare much better than the Russians did. And also, you shouldn't underestimate the Western resolve and unity in coming together and helping the victim of the invasion. So I think that these are lessons that might point to a direction which is much more caution. Nevertheless, seeing the misery of Russians might not be an antidote. That might be a line of thinking in Beijing where they say, oh, the Russians were miserably unsuccessful, but because they were stupid, they made a lot of mistakes. We will learn from these mistakes and won't repeat them.
Yeah. Sasha, we've got a question. I think we've lost Amy for now, but we're trying to get her back on. I've got a question that came in direct DM on NATO. Does China view NATO's support for Ukraine as a drain on the West's military resources, or as an opportunity for the West to expand its defense industrial base?
I think that, again, we are in a very early stage of this process. The systems that Taiwan will require to deter China and the system that Ukraine needs to repel Russian aggression are different, and there's going to be very different wars, except for kind of a couple of systems like Patriot and others. I think that the list of military toolkit that you need in both cases are very different because these are just very different contingencies. If a war in Ukraine reinvigorates Western defense industry and aids to kind of expanding the military-industrial complex in the U.S., that might be a bad news for China. And I think that the jury is out. The effort is there, but whether that will really bring results, we don't know yet.
Thank you for that. We've got one question coming in from Naomi Schur. Both Sasha and Amy touched on China's efforts in projecting its role as a peacemaker, as a veil behind its aim to ensure Putin's regime doesn't fall. As they pointed out, there's mixed reception to their efforts in regions like Europe and Southeast Asia, where China seems to be relatively successful. Under what scenarios could see China's image as a sincere peacemaker falter?
I think that if we see that China is really aiding the Russian war effort in a much more muscular way, and China takes a much more hands-on approach in helping Putin to win this war, that might be something that's definitely documented by the Western governments and friends of Ukraine, that's brought to the attention of the global audience, and that's where President Zelenskyy and the Ukrainian authorities might be also vocal about. This is where China, I think, maintains a very high degree of caution at this point.
Great, thank you for that. Let's see, I see my friend Bernard Zand is on here from Der Spiegel. Good to see you, Bernard. I'm going to see if he has any questions or wants to say any comments. Maybe you can bring him into the conversation. Used to be in Beijing. If it's the same Bernard, I think it is. And then let's see if we have any other questions. If not, Sasha, I think I'm going to let you maybe say some closing remarks before. Oh, I see Amy's back on, but as a listener. So I don't know how to get her back on as a speaker. But we're coming up on the last couple minutes here, and I want to give Sasha just a chance to make any final remarks. We'll try to get Amy back on as a speaker and give her that same opportunity. See if we can get my friend Bernard. It looks like maybe he's popped off. I didn't mean to scare him away. But Sasha, over to you for any final remarks before we close the session for the evening.
Two quick points. I think one, unfortunately, we are likely to see a lot of terrible images and terrible scenes coming from Ukraine for a couple of months, if not years. The war is not over. With all of the great sympathy, bravery, and resistance that Ukrainians demonstrate, there will be a lot of sacrifice. And some of the consequences of Russia's brutal invasion and the kind of terrible tools that the Russians use, and I'm very hurt to say it as a Russian, will be there lasting, including the total environmental degradation in the area affected by the explosion of the Kakhovskaya Dam. So this is tragic, and this tragedy will affect Ukraine first and foremost, but also many other parts of the world through supply chain, through agricultural production, and there are many second-order and third-order effects of this war that are terrible. Second point is that it's very likely that the relationship between Russia and the West are deeply broken. They might be repaired, but so far there is no opportunity inside. That means that Russia will have to pivot to China, and that this structural dependency that will be built might outlive Vladimir Putin. It's not that when Vladimir Putin is not president of Russia that things will go back to normal and the balance will return to Russian foreign policy. Structural dependency might be there for many years to come. Thanks.
Thank you, Sasha. Tragic is absolutely right, and the consequences are awful. 100%. Amy, I want to give you an opportunity to make a couple final remarks if you'd like. I think I have you back as a speaker.
Yes, sorry. I am back now. Just maybe a couple of points. Yeah, communications. So even if this war were to end militarily, and might take quite a long time, even if it were to end militarily, Ukraine is not exactly safe. And I believe it would need some kind of like military shield on a much, much bigger scale than like what you see in the Iron Dome in Israel, much, much bigger shield. I think that in recent weeks, we have seen that the new air defense system has worked. It even managed to shoot down Russia's latest hypersonic missiles. And I think also it shows that it was capable of protecting Kiev, where so many missiles were shot at the capital, but they managed to shoot it down. But unfortunately, it does not cover the whole of Ukraine because it's very big. Secondly, even if the war were to end militarily, it has to have a political settlement, and possibly maybe some kind of agreement where you have democratic countries wanting to continue to provide safety and protection and military support for Ukraine. And lastly, a point about China, because we're here talking about what we think China wants. And I believe what China wants and what is ideal for China right now is freezing the conflict so that it can take credit for stopping the bloodshed while putting the responsibility to achieve a resolution on others, and I guess would be like Western countries. And that a weak and internationally isolated Russia will open limitless economic opportunities for China. And no matter what happens, a humiliated Putin is still a perfect ally for China in its challenge to the collective West. And I think, lastly, about Taiwan, because I caught that question. In the absence of a long-term sustainable solution to Russia-Ukraine conflict, will keep the resources of the West focus on supporting Ukraine for as long as it takes. And this perhaps will make Taiwan a secondary issue for now.
Amy, thank you very much. And Sasha, thank you. Thanks to both of you, first of all, for making Carnegie China's first Twitter Spaces event an easy one, with relatively little difficulty, a few glitches here and there, but you were both terrific, and I appreciate your time and your insights. And I want to thank those who joined tonight to listen, and look forward again to trying to do a Twitter Spaces in the future. I think it went well, and we'll do it again. Thank you both. Thank you for listening to the China in the World podcast. For more episodes and research, please go to carnegieendowment.org. This episode was produced by Nathaniel Schur. The music was composed by Spencer Barnett.